Let's talk a little bit about exposure. And I'm not talking about the kind of exposure that can get you in trouble with the law. The exposure I'm talking about is photo-video related. And more specifically, exposure is the amount of light that the sensor or film is able to capture. Today I'm going to cover some of the basic camera settings that really controls how much light your camera actually captures. The three settings that I'm going to talk about are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. The terminology and technicality slightly differ between photography and videography, but for simplicity, I'm just going to stick with those three settings: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. I always tell people who are buying their first camera just to stick with auto settings to begin with. I think it really helps you just to become a little more comfortable with the camera itself. But when you really want to take control of the image that you're capturing, you definitely want to learn the manual settings. Let's start off with aperture. Aperture is measured in f-stops and t-stops, and you'll typically be able to see those markings on each individual lens. The smaller the number, the larger the opening. And with a larger opening, you're allowing more light to hit your sensor. This also gives a shallow depth of field. A higher f-stop, such as f16 or f22, is going to have a smaller opening, which in turn won't allow as much light to pass through the lens. You'll also have a larger depth of field. I think the idea of a larger opening allowing in more light than a smaller opening is a pretty simple concept to grasp. The next setting I'm going to cover is shutter speed. With certain types of cameras, there's actually a little door that covers the sensor called the shutter, which makes sense. Right. Yeah, shutter, door. So the shutter speed is the amount of time that that shutter stays open to allow light to hit the sensor. I don't know. Is this a sensor? Something like that. Let's say you had your shutter speed set to 1 second. This shutter door is going to open for 1 second and then close. So it's going to allow light to hit the sensor and expose it for that full second. So again, we're talking about the amount of light that we're allowing to hit our sensor. With a slower shutter speed, like 1 second, you're allowing more light to hit the sensor than a faster shutter speed of, say, 1/50th of a second or 1/200th of a second. With the faster shutter speeds, it's opening and closing much quicker than the longer shutter speeds. Let me think of a good example of how to explain shutter speed. I got it. So the best example that I could think of was using a sponge in water, where the sponge represents the sensor or the film, and the water represents the light. If you take the sponge by itself without any water, it's basically like a sensor or your film that is not exposed to any light at all. So if it doesn't touch the water, it's not exposed. It's literally not exposed to the water. If you take the sponge and put it in the water for, let's say, 1/4 of a second, it's going to pick up some of that water, so it'll be exposed somewhat to the water. But if you take that sponge and leave it in the water for 1 or 2 seconds, the sponge is going to be completely saturated. It will be completely exposed to the water. Actually, that was a pretty good example. Without going into too much history, there was a standard that was set years ago, and it's called the 180-degree shutter roll. Basically what this is, it's a standard to set your shutter speed. If you're shooting 30 frames per second, double that, and you would want 1/60th of a second. When you observe the 180 roll when it comes to the shutter, you're going to achieve the most realistic, natural-looking motion blur. I'll show you an example of this using a fidget spinner. And as a side note, when I was setting up this overhead shot, I realized how bad my hands look. We got a new kitten about a month ago, and she tears into my hands. Maybe I should use her as clickbait for this video. So this is Nugget, and she's gonna possibly help me explain shutter speed using a fidget spinner. Right now I'm using the 180-degree shutter roll For this camera, I'm shooting 24 frames a second, and my shutter speed is actually at 1/50th because you can't set a shutter speed at 1/48th of a second. So 1/50th is close enough. So if I spin this, and if I pause that video, you'll be able to see the motion blur in that. So if I want to crank this shutter speed past 1/50th of a second, you'll notice that less light is able to hit the sensor. 1/60th, 1/80th, 1/100th, 1/125th, 1/60th, 1/200th, 1/250th, 1/320, 1/400th, 1/500th. So what I'll do is just add some more lights so we're able to actually see this when we spin it at 1/500th. So we'll spin it again. And if we pause the video here, you'll be able to see a significantly less amount of motion blur. The 180 rule is good to know, but you can also break that rule. It's not set in stone. It all depends on the look that you're going for. Think about some situations where you would want to crank your shutter so you didn't have any motion blur. The best example that I can think of would be sports photography, where there's a lot of action, a lot of fast movement, but you want your image to be crisp and clear. The last setting I want to cover today is ISO. The ISO in your camera is really just how sensitive your sensor is to light. The lower the setting, let's say ISO 100, the less sensitive your sensor will be to light. But the higher you keep taking that ISO, the more noise you're going to introduce into your image. Cranking your ISO should always be a last resort when you need more light. A year ago, I was asked to do an overnight shoot for a paranormal group in an abandoned prison. This was a situation where I needed to set the ISO a lot higher than I normally would because I didn't want to be a distraction by moving lights around.
Follow that instinct.
Are you alone?
What did they do to you down here?
You find some interesting things. Or they find you, maybe.
So I guess that's the end of my basic lighting, camera setting, aperture, shutter speed, ISO tutorial. Was this even a tutorial? If you got anything from this video, leave a comment. If there's anything I missed, leave a comment. If you don't have anything to say, leave a comment. I almost forgot. Last week, I did a lighting recreation video, which I'll link that at the end of this one. But I actually had 2 people attempt to recreate the same lighting setup that I did, which was pretty awesome to see how other people went about trying to light a scene. So I just want to thank September and Matt for sending me their photos. And actually, Matt even sent me a video of his behind the scenes, how he set everything up.
Actual color gels.
Thanks for watching. If you have any more questions, thoughts, critiques, just leave it in the comments.